And this webinar this afternoon is being brought to you by both the William Temple Foundation and the Diocese of Gloucester. For those of you who perhaps are coming across the foundation for the first time, the William Temple Foundation was founded as an educational charity in 1947 to promote and reflect the work and thinking of Archbishop William Temple. Temple was both Archbishop of York and Canterbury during the Second World War, and his greatest achievement was reimagining the sort of Britain that could be built after the Second World War. In his book Christianity and Social Order, which was published in 1942, he lays out his vision for what becomes the post-war universal and comprehensive welfare state, which Beveridge continues after Temple sadly dies in 1944. Temple is the person who in fact coined the phrase, the welfare state, and so our role as a foundation that bears his name is to continue to promote research and new critical thinking that links theology and the life of the church, indeed the life of faith and belief more generally, with the ever-changing public squares in which we currently live. We do this via our very varied and prolific outputs, our Temple tracts, our podcasts, our blogs, our publications, and webinars such as this. And for more details on all of these, please do visit our website at williamtemplefoundation.org.uk. This webinar on the theme of Digital Afterlives comes from one of our strands of inquiry called our Ethical Futures Group, which explores theological and ethical responses to the challenges posed by both climate emergency and the rapid growth in digital technologies. It's convened by Reverend Dr. John Reader, and Professor Maggi Savin-Baden is a key contributor to the group. And I'm delighted to say that we will hear more from both of them later on. So I'm now going to pass over to Reverend Andrew Braddock, who is Director of Mission and Ministry for the Diocese of Gloucester, who, as I said, are co-hosting this event. And he's going to say a few words about what we think this event is about. Andrew, over to you.
Chris, thank you very much. And on behalf of the Diocese of Gloucester, delighted to be able to co-sponsor this event with the William Temple Foundation. As you know, the title for this webinar is Digital Afterlives, Death, Technology and Pastoral Care. In the next hour or so, we're going to be exploring then the intersection between death and bereavement, remembrance and pastoral care, and the growing place of digital technology within all of that. I suspect we've got quite a varied group of people on this call. You might have come because you're curious about this whole area and want to learn more. You might be here because you're confused about it. You might be here because you're concerned about some of the implications around the digital world and this whole notion of the digital afterlife. And so we're going to try and explore that for you this afternoon in this time we've got together. And I'm really grateful that we've got a wonderful array of different speakers this evening who can open up for us all the themes and some of the issues and questions that surround this topic. So I hope this is going to be exploratory. This is going to be something where we are all going to be learning and exploring together. Chris, thanks for co-sponsoring this, and I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Andrew, very much. So as Andrew indicated, we've got a series of speakers this afternoon who will help us explore this new terrain. And so we thought we'd start off with an overview of the key thoughts, the key thinking, the key new developments that's happening in this area of digital afterlives. And that's going to be presented by Maggi Savin-Baden, who I'll introduce in a minute. We then thought it'd be good to get three responses that were kind of earthing some of this debate in the so what? So how is this landing in the kind of everyday life of our parishes, of our communities? How is this landing in things like the work of funeral directors and how's this landing in other areas of big tech. So we're going to have a series of speakers who address that, and then we'll open the floor to you. We'll take questions in the chat box, or questions that you want to, or comments or reflections that you want to offer, and then I'll invite Dr. John Reader to sum up for us at the end. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Maggi Savin-Baden, who is Professor of Higher Education Research at the University of Worcester. Maggi has completed 21 books, including 2 on digital afterlife and 1 on AI, death and dying. She is also a licensed lay reader. So Maggi, thank you very much for sharing some of your latest research with us, and over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I just wanted to say to everybody that that's my noise. Are you getting back chat here? Because I'm getting it. It's gone.
Sorry, Maggi, before you say any further, if we're getting a lot of interference, it might be good if people just mute themselves and kill their screens, just to reduce the bandwidth. Okay, Maggi, sorry.
Yeah, all I was going to say was that I've sent a PDF of the slides over to Tim. So if you're interested in having the slides afterwards, do feel free to message Tim. So I'm just going to share my screen and kick off from here and check my time. Okay, I think we're going now. Sorry about that glitch. So I'm going to talk about post-digital afterlife and the spiritual realm, based on a book that I've recently finished and some research I've done in this area as well. One of the things that I think is quite interesting, whether you talk to people of faith or people without a faith, that there's a sense that digital afterlife is about the continuation of an active or a passive digital presence after death. And there's been a shift in the language. We used to talk about 5-6 years ago about digital immortality, but there's been a move away from that towards afterlife, because the idea is that people don't really think that we carry on forever. Whereas the spiritual realm is spoken about by people in something that's often connected to the physical world. It exists alongside it. Now, I know for many of you here, you may have very strong theologies of death and afterlife, but my research comes very much from reading and interviewing people about their perspectives on this. So it's about something that's maybe akin to heaven, somewhere we go after death. For others, obviously, they see it as a place of ghosts and spirits and deities, and obviously we can look back to Hamlet and various other pieces of literature in this area. But one of the things that's quite interesting in this territory is that there's a confusion about the language. So one of the other things that I've sought to do is to begin to put together the different terms, so that we've got a language both in the secular world, in the faith world, about the kinds of phrases that we're using. So things like digital traces are the things that we leave behind on social media, whereas legacy is about what we actually leave in terms of photographs. And then there are other funny kinds of phrases like digital death, after death to a living being or an object and the way it affects somebody. I've talked about digital afterlife. There's also a phrase that people use, which is digital remains, which is more about the accumulated content. And then there are stranger things, which again, many of you may have seen, is the use of dead people in media. after death, Carrie Fisher classically in Star Wars, use of Bob Monkhouse in adverts, those kinds of things. And then digital inheritors, those that we leave behind who inherit our memories, and we may or may not have discussed what we're leaving them and whether they want it or not. So I undertook a piece of research with 16 people with some in-depth interviews from various faiths. Quite often they were experts and faith leaders in this area. And I'm just going to talk a bit about two of these. One of them was memorialization and the other one was perspectives. So in terms of memorialization, people spoke about the culture associated with memorialization, this need to care, the sense of wanting to manage the presence and visibility of the dead in cyberspace. There was also a real sense right across the participants, whether they were Sikh or Christians, about remembrance needing to be something that was tasteful and not gaudy. And there's also the idea, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides, the notion of transposition of the sacramental into the digital world, which I feel that Andrew himself is more of an expert on this than I am in terms of online communion in COVID. The second one was about perspectives on digital afterlife. A lot of people were quite concerned that their afterlife was created for them, default through social media. So the sense of death and the afterlife became trivialized by Facebook still leaving your profile behind because people hadn't chosen to close it down or had a legacy contact who could do that. I've also done some research funded by the Ministry of Defence on creating a digital immortal, a digital virtual human, a copy of oneself. And when I asked people about whether they would choose to do that, some people were quite fascinated by it, and other people said, well, why would I bother? Or what's the point? Because I know where I'm going anyway. But there was also this sense of social media being separate from the spiritual realm, and a confusion about the relationship between social media and where the soul might be located physically after death. So some of the things that I want to introduce you to are two terms, death tech and semtech. I've just put the pictures up to kind of relieve the text in this. And these are just some of the ones that are quite popular at the moment. So My Wishes is quite old now. It's 2 or 3 years old, and it's quite effective, and it gives you tutorials on preparing for death on social media sites. Other ones are things like empathy, which helps you to manage your affairs pre and post death. LifeNaut has been going for about 10 years, and it makes some interesting claims about being able to create a copy of yourself that they will upload into your avatar when you have died and gone, and it will create an avatar that will speak, and it will learn, and it will become sentient, which I think is all very doubtful, but it's quite interesting. Record Me Now is quite a nice, easy app that you can put on your phone that you can record your memories and leave those behind. And then Digital Immortality Now is a site that it's a bit smoke and mirrors, really. It suggests you can have cheap, affordable digital immortality now, but there isn't an awful lot of evidence for that. I'm thinking I might be tight on time here, but Semtech, just again for you to see, this is the Encyclopedia of Cemetery Technology, if you've not seen that. And then the idea of the transposition of the sacramental, the idea that sacramental practices and the sacred are being moved into the digital is quite an interesting concern that I'm exploring with John Reader. Transposition suggests deliberation, we think, but maybe it's actually a migration and it's not deliberate. And the idea that maybe we're not, I think Sandra will speak to this, the idea of ritual changing, and I'm suggesting that we might have new digital ritual practices. So I'm going to finish there, and I've put up who's got a question, but I think actually Sandra and Harry and various others are actually going to respond to some of this. So I'm going to finish there.
Thanks very much, Maggie, for that overview. And I think there's lots of terms there that people will probably want to come back and ask you to kind of explain a little bit more. Like, for example, the idea of a cyber soul I thought was really tantalizing, and maybe we'll come back to that thought later on. But thank you very much for giving us that really helpful and excellent overview. So I'm now going to invite some responses to some of these themes and issues that Maggie's raised from the kind of current research. And I'm going to first of all invite Sandra Millar to give a response based on her kind of extensive day-to-day work with parishes and local communities across England in her work as head of life events and welcome for the Church of England. So Sandra, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and very much looking forward to hearing some of the responses that you're hearing on the ground to this kind of issue. Over to you.
Thank you. Actually, I'm sure I'm here as an imposter. You see, my knowledge of Digital Afterlives is really limited to stories like, Kim Kardashian's dead father appearing at her birthday party, or watching Years and Years, that marvellous drama from 2019, which still haunts me, about a world that I might be inhabiting in 14 years. And it's true to say that whilst my work nationally takes me into two areas, one is research with the public as to some of the things they're thinking and experiencing about funerals, death and bereavement, and also to listening to the experience of ministers, ordained and lay ministers who are involved with funerals. It's true to say that some of these issues are still a long way from being everyday currency for people, although the knowledge is increasing. So for me, what this is about is two things. One, how are people who have experienced the death of someone they know, how have they experienced this? What's some of the things they're concerned about? And how do us as ministers feel about it? And the intersection between those two, which is what I would call pastoral care. Now, for most people, particularly during the last 18 months, the actual simplest place they're experiencing death as digital is in the whole world of the changing ritual, which will include something that we now possibly have even forgotten is digital, which is live streaming of funerals. And that allows something else to happen. It allows the recording of a funeral to happen, which means that people can watch that in the future. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, even the idea of taking photographs at the funeral was weird. But now, actually, a growing business is, for example, videoing and recording a funeral ceremony in the way you would do a wedding. So for most people, that's going to be the starting point. There's one other thing that might appear in the way that the ritual's put together, which is actually the use of a recording or a video that's been made by the person who's died to play at the funeral, to say what they're thinking and feeling. And how does that sit with us when we're putting together the shape of a liturgy for people? But that's possibly the starting point. But of course, as rituals change and as people are in this space at the moment where they're saying increasingly, we don't want to spend a lot of money for a funeral. In fact, we might not want a funeral at all. Where will the digital come into that? What will step into that space? What kind of things will they put together, and what technologies will they use? The second big area really for people is after the funeral, and it's about what we call grief or bereavement and remembering, which are two different things. Step one is grief, that intense phase when we really miss someone who has died, and we go through that process. And we might ask ourselves, what is the place in the journey of grief to remembering of words and of objects? Now, one of the great hit programs of the last couple of years is the repair shop, and everything in the repair shop is so often is about the significance of an object to do with the person who's died that is held on to over many, many years and is simply restored because of what it means to that family. And all of us will know in our own lives the significance of keeping letters, or the difficulty in the first days after the death of someone we care about, of letting go of the, I'm showing my age here, the last answer phone message that we had from them, not wanting to delete the texts and the WhatsApp, but keeping them being able to hear a voice again becomes very important. And one of our skills as pastors is to knowing when that is a normal part of grief to do that, and when that has become problematized. And one of my questions that I'm wrestling is what is the fundamental difference between the shifting technologies from the days when there were letters that people treasured, through phone calls that people treasured, through digital imprint that people treasure? When does that become a problem for people? But also the other problem I think that is very real is that people don't necessarily understand the nature of permanence. The thing is, if you found a bunch of letters from your person who died, you could destroy them. You know, much drama is built on this, that you put them in the fire and their impact is over for you forever. The problem with the digital messaging that we have is that it cannot ever it cannot be destroyed. What is permanence? And what does that mean for people pastorally? So on the one hand, it could be very positive that you can keep this digital imprint and you can look to it and it speaks to you and it's part of your story over many, many years in the same way as letters have been. But on the other hand, what does it mean if you can't erase the memory of someone and you need to? What if you've had a troubled and difficult relationship? Or what if that person has done things in their digital imprint that you'd rather not be visiting again? How do we deal with those issues? And perhaps the other difficult thing for some people is the problem of a person who might want to control use through their digital imprint in the future. So I guess, again, this is a trope used in much literature and so on, is the idea that someone has created, the famous one, I think, for me, or the most well-known for me, is something like Cecilia Ahern, Guess How Much, P.S. I Love You, where someone has recorded a series of tapes to be listened to kind of every 6 months through someone's life on into the future after their death. But that gets more complex with technologies. How much control then does a dead person have over the living? You know, I think to myself, I'm really glad that I've got certain items from my parents who've been dead some considerable while, but I do truthfully think I would not still be wanting to have my mother tapping on my shoulder and speaking to me now, telling me what I should be doing at this stage of life. And if you've had a difficult relationship, then that could become very much a pastoral issue going forward. So for me, those are some of the practical questions that are coming up, and I'll stop there because I know that both Harry will address some of those in a moment and we'll hear from others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that great, I think, just earthing some of the issues and the kind of categories that Maggie was beginning to try introduce to us. Things like digital traces and that kind of thing. So that's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. So I'd now like to get another perspective, hear another perspective on this kind of emerging shift from the kind of the actual to the digital, if you like, or the physical to the digital. And it'd be great to hear the perspectives of somebody working at the coalface of all these issues, namely undertakers. And we're very grateful to Edd Frost, who's an undertaker operating across North Oxfordshire, to share some of his reflections on this kind of shifting landscape that we're in. So Edd, welcome, and over to you.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Yeah, this is a fascinating area for me. I still think the funeral profession, so to speak, is still very much back in the dark ages still. We're trying very hard to keep up with a very fast-moving society. But at the same time, my business has been in operation now 8 years, and I like to think that we're kind of ahead of the game with regards to social media and profiles and things. But at the same time, listening to what Sandra said, I too kind of agree with her that we're still at the back end, really, of where we see sort of profiles and footprints and things. Because, I mean, where we've made huge steps through lockdown, is seeing the live streaming of funeral services. I mean, that has become a wonderful tool for everybody to keep people involved. And I think it's something that's actually changed society now. Like, as Sandra has said, and I totally agree. I mean, my first funeral 8 years ago, we had a photographer to capture the event. Now, I thought it was a fantastic opportunity. And at the time, I remember the sheer horror of people's the faces seeing a photographer there taking pictures, but afterwards, every member of the family thinking, that was I'm so pleased we've got captured this event, because it's all we ever see in history are, you know, the royal family or celebrities. Why can't we normal families have the same kind of opportunities to remember and capture the events of grandfather's funeral, and pass it on to members of the family that wouldn't ever have known? So obviously we've seen that the change now. Still, in cases, people can be uncomfortable having a photographer flying around. However, I think it is something that is becoming more acceptable due to COVID and lockdown, because of the back of live streaming. We probably did, in the 6 years before COVID, probably 4 services that were filmed and kept for posterity. But during COVID, I think we did about 25. And it's something now that's actually talked about regularly when we make arrangements with families. Certainly social media footprints, Facebook, there's a huge shift now from newspaper notices to social media. And we have, you know, our family funeral director Facebook page has a following of over 5,500 people. So when we share a newspaper notice, it can reach maybe up anything from 5,000 to 35,000 people, which is a huge kind of stretch at no cost. We don't charge for this service. So from that point of view, that is, you know, that's where the digital world comes in to us. Afterwards, that's not something that I can kind of really talk about as such. But again, it was interesting hearing Sandra talking about, you know, creating profiles to keep for people to look at in the future, but also there can be dangers maybe with that, creating a false profile of somebody that we thought was, you know, wonderful and can be very much controlled and manipulated. Without saying too much, look at Jimmy Savile. I mean, we all thought he was you know, what he did for charity, and, you know, these things change. And if things are locked forever in a digital footprint, how can you change these things if we don't have control? So it can be quite scary as well, but there are definitely pros and cons from our point of view. I'm just saying what other notes I've made. Yeah, really, from my point of view, I just think from the digital side, it's giving everybody, our normal day-to-day families, the opportunity to record, capture events of funeral services to keep for posterity.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ed, very much. And, you know, maybe there'll be some questions kind of, you know, coming up towards us, I suppose, about, although you may be not having to deal so much with the afterlife bit rather than the kind of the funeral itself, whether you're picking up any questions that people are wanting to ask you about, you know, what services you offer, or whether you're picking up any anxieties about, you know, that sort of situation that you wouldn't have normally, as it were. But thank you very much for that overview. I'm now going to introduce our final respondent to the kind of the context that Maggi was outlining for us. Again, somebody who's operating in the field of tech, but very much coming at it from a kind of development and production point of view. It's my great pleasure to introduce Harry Hobson. Harry describes himself as a technology innovation expert and social entrepreneur. He advises big tech firms and is director of the Neighbourly Lab, a non-profit innovation organisation. And he also describes himself as a not very good Christian. So thank you very much, Harry. And we look forward to hearing what you say to us. We're getting through the time quite quickly. So, you know, if you want to go a little bit over what you were perhaps, you know, the time frame, please don't feel constrained to gallop through it. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And hi, everybody. It's really good to be on this webinar with you all, and thank you. And look forward to sharing some ideas with you now. Thanks for introducing me. Just in really simple, I guess I'm here because I do lots of work for big tech firms like Facebook and Google and WhatsApp and Spotify and Intel. And I've done lots of work over the last few years helping them think about kind of what happens when people die. And it started for Facebook particularly as almost a sort of sanitary problem of like how to make the platform kind of work okay once users start to cease to exist. It was a problem they never foresaw when they invented the app, but then of course it sort of just kind of appeared unexpectedly as a problem as the app endured and got bigger. And oh, hang on, sorry, my lights are just flickering. I'm just going to do some, just one sec. Sorry, hold on. Okay. I'm back. Sorry about that.
I hope that's no one trying to send you a message, Harry.
It might have been, yeah, exactly. It's like a seance. Hopefully just a dimmer switch. So yeah, I got really interested in this from a very sort of almost a rather prosaic problem of just like, how do we make this thing, this useful social network, continue to stay useful even though people are dying? And that led to Facebook's things like services to do with legacy contact and how people authorize somebody to kind of manage, be responsible for their legacy after they die. So very, very interesting this area. And I now run a not-for-profit organization called Neighbourly Lab, which is all about technology and infrastructure to do with increasing connectedness and connection around the UK. I'll put the link to that in the chat later on if anyone wants to go and look at that. But yeah, let me just share, I'm going to share my screen actually now and share a few slides with you, if that's okay. Not too much, just a few minutes of slides. Let me do that now. Find them, presents. I guess you can all see my screen. If anyone, someone shout if it's not visible, I'm sure it is. Yeah. So I'm interested particularly in the next few minutes to think about how we live on as nodes in a social network. And I'll tell you what I want to explore. But let me just start by, I hope this is helpful, but just to think about what do we mean when we talk about tech or technology? Because it's sort of, there's so much of it and it's all around us. And for me at least, it helps to think of it in two different ways. First of all, just as an environment. So technology is like an environment where we just spend a lot of our time. This is, according to the latest figures from Ofcom, if you want to delve into this, go to Ofcom, which is the regulator for telecoms and internet and stuff. The latest sort of figures are about 4 hours overall amongst all UK adults averaged of time spent online every day. So it's about a quarter of our waking time is spent online. As I'm sure you will obviously know, for young people, it's much higher. It's up to 5 or 6 hours for teens. And, you know, as this sort of photo suggests, and as we all know, it's not just about the time use, it's also almost about the primacy of how the world is experienced for younger people, especially. They are digital natives born into a world of pervasive tech and screens. And younger people especially almost kind of default to online as a means of communication, as a means of thinking about things in a way that people of my age or would default to kind of real world settings. The presumption amongst younger people, as we all know, is to start online. So it's not just a time use thing, it's also a kind of primacy thing. So that's the environment of tech. I think that's the first way to think about it, is it's kind of a quarter or a third of people's time is spent in these environments. So of course they matter, and of course we have to think about them. But the second thing I think about it is its power. And it's, you know, concentrated in Silicon Valley, but also in China and elsewhere, is an unprecedented concentration of brain power and resources and money and optimism and energy. And some area, and of course, you know, things are moving incredibly fast, especially in the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence. But some of the progress areas which are moving incredibly fast, which are particularly relevant to this area, is first of all this rise of assistants or avatars. So kind of basically computers acting like humans, or kind of filling a role that we're used to humans playing for us, like helping us do things, and often kind of personified, often given names, most obviously like Alexa and Siri and so on. The second thing which goes with this is ever more natural and immersive interfaces, and particularly speech and conversation. VR means virtual reality, which is all the immersive stuff, and glasses and headsets and the metaverse and all that, which is kind of coming along quite quickly. But the thing I think which is kind of amazing is just how quickly the spoken interface. So it's like, people are amazed that when they're reminded that Alexa's only launched in the UK in 2017 and only really became mainstream in 2018. So you're used now to going to someone's home and speaking to this little machine which answers questions or whatever, but it's only been around for 3 or 4 years in the UK. It's new, and yet it's very quickly become kind of mainstream in our lives. And I think a third force, which is a big deal in tech, is services which are going deeper, delving deeper into our interior and emotional lives. So lots of apps to do with mental health and well-being, like Calm or Headspace, which are kind of claiming ever more interior emotional territory for us, and kind of being invited deeper into our souls or our lives or our psyches. My view is that the progress of tech is pretty much impossible to control, unfortunately, because it's so powerful, it's so global, and it's so competitive. So I mean, this obviously we don't want to. This isn't about regulation. This conversation, but basically, I would say essentially the only break on stuff happening is people's behaviours and cultural norms. And my view is that those change incredibly quickly, as a very nice example from Sandra and Edd about videos, about funerals being videoed. If we think about how quickly that has kind of reset its default in terms of how willing people are for that to happen. So there's a very good quote from someone called John Culkin in the 60s: "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." It's often attributed to Marshall McLuhan as well. We shape our tools, and our tools shape us. And I think that's kind of right, is that we make stuff and we get made by the stuff we make. And I think that's kind of what's happening with tech. So my view, for what it's worth, is that the stuff which can happen, the kind of things which Maggie outlined about avatars and digital presences that live on, almost all of it will happen. The only constraint on it is people's willingness, if people wanting it. And the signs to me at the moment is that people will want it and do want it. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, in fact, the last few minutes of this talk, is I want to explore an idea with you which isn't actually very much about technology. In fact, perhaps it's not really at all about technology, or hardly at all, but it's inspired by a tech point of view. And it's about network thinking and the idea of us being nodes in a network. So here's the hypothesis I'd like to explore. It's that during our lives now, we become nodes in networks. And our role as a node in a network persists. It lives on whether we're here or not. It lives on after we die. And my view is that that is perhaps the most important part of what constitutes our kind of afterlife. I want to put that idea out there, that our role as a network node is a big part of our afterlife. And then what I want to leave us with, or start thinking about, is that in the moment or the year after somebody dies, what happens in that first few months or year can massively affect the longevity and the ongoing power of their network, their afterlife network. So briefly, what are you talking about networks from a tech point of view? So a node is defined, it's from the Latin, a knot. It just means that we're all these little blue things with all the little grey things around us. We're all nodes in networks. And networks, this is a map which looks completely baffling. And if you'll start to make sense of it. You can see Stanford on the left, and you can see Hawaii on a dotted line on the left, and you can see NYU, New York University, and Harvard on the right, and the Pentagon in the bottom right-hand corner, and Texas at the bottom. This is a map of the internet. The very first, it was called the ARPANET in those days, from the mid-70s. And so the internet is nothing but a network. It's a network of computers, and it was built to be resilient. In other words, it was built in the height of the Cold War, or what they thought was the height of the Cold War, to withstand, to make the American computing system and missile defense system resilient against a Russian nuclear strike. And it meant that, and this is the genius of the internet, it means that you can take out any of those nodes and it self-routes and recorrects around a node. So in other words, the network endures beyond the existence of any one node. And that is basically the sort of fundamental idea of the internet and of networks. And techies get very excited about networks because of a law called Metcalfe's law, which is that the power of the network is exponentially increases with each connection. So as you add one or two more nodes, the number of connections starts to increase rapidly, kind of exponentially, as you can see. So there's a kind of power law around networks, which is something that excites technologists quite rightly. And so you can dig deeper into that with Googling Metcalfe's law if you want to. So during our lifetime, we are nodes in a network, kind of very obviously, really. We might be active nodes. We might be actively going, oh, Bertie, you need to meet Susan. You both have just moved into Chiswick. We might be introducing people. We might be party givers. We might not be party givers. It doesn't matter. Consciously, unconsciously, we create connections around us, whether we want to or not. Some more than others, but we do it. And we know that this matters massively to us all. Social scientists call it social capital and divide it up into bridging capital, bonding capital, and everything. And we all know from the science and intuitively how important a strong network is. It's vital to prevent loneliness. It's vital to prevent polarization of opinion and to keep and for information exchange. It's what gives us a sense of movement in our lives, or horizons, or possibility. It enables us to find help when we need help. So having a strong network is vital. It's probably the most important thing for us while we're alive. For me, the most exciting point, like with that story of the internet, is that connections that we make endure beyond the connector. So I'll give you a couple of examples. A party you may have held at college or university, even now has an echo to it, an after echo, is that friendships will have been made through you at parties you gave or at people who gathered around you. And you probably have forgotten those parties, but the friendships might live on. Or another example is if you're married or have a partner now, you can think about how you first met that person, and it will have been through somebody or actively or inadvertently introduced by somebody. And you probably no longer know that person. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It kind of doesn't matter. The fact is you now have that partner or whatever, thanks to what happened. Very often the same with jobs that you've got. Whatever job or role you're doing now was thanks to a series of introductions or other people's social networks who acted as nodes, and you've got that job and the work is done, if you like. So in some ways, the exciting claim here is that we can see during our lifetime that the connections outlive the connector. The connections we make outlive the connector. And that therefore means that whether we're alive or dead, that our value and our role as a node in a network and as a connector can endure. And value can be thought of quantitatively, like the number of connections, but also qualitatively, the quality of the connections. So the degree of trust or the degree of presumption of good intent on the part of two people who both have me in common or whatever. So I'm going to just present to finish a couple of ideas about how we could boost the kind of longevity of a person's network. And here are a couple of ideas. So these are 2 or 3 ideas, just I'm putting them out there for how we, as people who are interested in kind of what happens just at the point that people die, or funerals and rituals around that, what more could we do to think about how we strengthen that enduring afterlife of people's connections to make someone who's died a strong ongoing node in that network? So one thing is just to celebrate it and to acknowledge it and make more of it. So it might be that at funerals or gatherings, we kind of, we celebrate it. We say we wouldn't, this group of 30 people sitting here in this office or this church, this very group could not be assembled in any other way apart from thanks to Sue or whatever, for bringing us all together. So we can make something of it. We can celebrate it. We can acknowledge it. That's the first, perhaps most obvious thing. The second thing I think, which is interesting, is we can structure the ritual or the gathering deliberately to maximize the ongoing connections that happen from that point on. So we can think like a party host or a conference organizer. Party hosts or conference organizers, obviously, what they're looking to maximize is the network effect of what happens after the thing they do. They want people to mix, they want people to meet, they want people to recognize common ground. So we can think harder about what it would be like to design gatherings and rituals in order to be like stewards of that ongoing afterlife, of that ongoing network. How do we make more of that network? And a really, probably the most kind of simple tip, obviously here, is always to default to having some ongoing communications, whether it's WhatsApp or email or whatever. So find an excuse to say, right, we're going to build an email list of everyone, or we're going to send a copy of the photos to everybody. So we need to make sure you're all on email or WhatsApp, because those WhatsApp groups or email lists have enormous amounts of value just as an ongoing way for people to be in touch with each other, to have each other's contact details, to have a reason to keep communicating with each other. So don't let people leave a room without them having been connected digitally, so we can have ongoing comms. And then third and final thought, and Sandra, this came from some of that work that we did together a couple of years ago, some of that research, was this idea of maybe do the gathering or a different kind of gathering a bit later, 6 months or a year after the point that someone dies, or given COVID, where funerals didn't take place properly, sadly, for so long, do it again, have another go at it. So I think that the idea of delaying or having a service or a gathering or a ritual which happens 6 or 12 months later has particular value because of the kind of people's emotional readiness to bond and to want to kind of rebuild and ongoing social connections. And then final thought is that you can introduce kind of formats or forcing factors to make it happen more. So here's just, I'm leaving you with a fun idea, which we kind of slightly jokingly called Here's to Granny. But what's clever about this idea, or at least what's kind of fun about it, is that in this case, Granny has put 500 quid behind the bar at her favourite pub and said, it's going to happen, whatever happens 6 months after my death. And so the insight here is that sometimes it takes a nudge or a kind of setting a default to make a thing happen. And why not kind of almost preordain it so it can't not happen. So just a kind of a bit of an idea to leave us with. So the kind of conclusion really here is that, as I said, during our lives, we can think of ourselves as nodes in networks. This role persists and endures whether we're there or not, and therefore persists and endures after we die, and as such constitutes a big part of our kind of digital afterlife, well, our general afterlife. And then the question I'm interested in is what can we do to help prolong this network afterlife?
Thank you.
So yeah, that's enough from me. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry, very much indeed. I think a lot of what you've said has, you know, brought some of the things that Maggie was saying and Sandra and the others into a kind of more, you know, brought us back to the digital, but in a kind of very, very practical way, and given us some sense of what it's like to be part of a connection. And when you talked about network and nodes, it felt like a very kind of post-digital description of the communion of saints somehow, that we're kind of nodes in this network that's eternal and goes on forever. And one thing that we haven't really been able to do in this session is to unpack some of the theology behind some of these terms, you know, and these concepts of death and resurrection and so on and so forth. But maybe John will bring in some of those thoughts at the end. So we got about another 20 minutes, and I want to give John a good 7 minutes or so. So maybe we've got about 10 to 12 minutes to take any questions that you have. Please put your hand up in the chat room, or put through any comments in the chat box addressed to any of our panelists, or just throwing some thoughts and ideas out there that our panelists can discuss. So so over to you. Tim's just made the point there about if you want to ask a question but don't want to be included in the final recording, let him know and he can edit you out. So please don't worry about asking a question. You're going to appear forever in a digital loop that is this event. You'll be edited out. Who would like to start us off with a question or a comment? And Andrew, if you could help me, if you see any hands going up, I can't necessarily see them. Thank you. Whilst we're waiting for questions to come through, Maggie, I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more, just very quickly, about, you mentioned cyber souls and this idea of avatars. Is it possible just to very quickly say what the concept of a cyber soul is?
I'm not sure I use the word cyber soul. I think I talked about virtual humans. What people are doing is creating copies of themselves to leave behind. So a couple of years ago, we created a virtual copy of me, which had a head and lip sync and my voice, and people could talk to me and ask me questions when I wasn't there. So there's an interesting idea that this will be possible to do. Some companies are arguing that they will become sentient in 40 years' time. Sadly, I won't be here to see that happen, but I just think it's an interesting concept. So, it's the idea that my daughter could, as Sandra was saying, sort of tap on my shoulder and say, "Hey, Mum, what do you think I should do about this?" And there are books like the Afterwife and various other ones that have kind of put these ideas forward as being possibilities. Where they're sold, Chris, I've no idea.
Thanks very much. So we have a question from Esther. Esther, over to you.
Hi, my question's for Harry. I quite liked the idea of how we are creating networks, and I've just that whole idea of every time we have any event in church, how we can keep in touch with people and not waste that. But I'm really conscious of all this GDPR stuff and how you do that. But also, what about the GDPR of those who don't want to be kept on? What happens? When do you lose your right to object? Is that speak now or forever hold your peace type thing? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. You mean, Esther, in terms of people who don't want to be part of an ongoing group, like, for example, who attended a funeral, for example, or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Both. So for WhatsApp, certainly the other people that don't want to be part of it, and how you manage that, and maybe not a WhatsApp group, but just having an online presence, even once you're dead, that's an online presence you might not want. And does anybody know what the GDPR rules are? What if someone just isn't that kind of a person, but they are still out there, still online, being Facebooked, and every year their bezies are sending them happy birthday messages, and they may not want that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, go on, Maggie. Yeah.
There aren't any. I'm a member of the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and this kind of thing is hotly debated. In fact, the Bishop of Oxford is probably better placed than me to answer the question. But no, there aren't. I mean, the safest thing to do is to ensure that you've got a digital will sorted out. But even then, there are lots of arguments between family members about what should be kept, whether Facebook profiles should be taken down or not. And so you need to be very clear about what it is you want, because otherwise they'll be even more roused than they might otherwise be.
Digital will, wow, new. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther, very much for your questions. There's a couple of questions coming through on the chat. Michelle Sims said, "Who would administrate an ongoing WhatsApp group email list? That's a job forever." Or maybe that's a comment rather than a specific question. Has anybody got any responses to that idea of administrating an ongoing WhatsApp group email list?
I've no idea, but don't let it hold you back. I think it's more important to do it and somehow.
Okay, thank you. And Mary Lappin puts a question in the chat box. Photographs of family members, known or who were dead before I was born, are very important in fostering identity and belonging to a family. Any thoughts on how digital traces may contribute to belonging or identity? So I guess that's anybody. Sandra, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where I was going really with the whole pastoral issues that arise from this, and my sort of sense of what is fundamentally new about the technologies that are emerging, and what is fundamentally the same as it's ever been when a new technology comes along in the process of identity and grief. And I actually think that's where we get into some theological questions, both about identity and about pastoral care as well. So as I've got the name of the questioner, was it Maggie again? Or something like that, but I can't remember the question.
My name's Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I couldn't remember. Double letters were in there somewhere. That's why I said Maggie. I was like, there's a double letter in there. It was in his surname. But I think this fact that, you know, we can see that from all these sort of television programs like Who Do You Think You Are and so on, that actually having something that reminds you of where you've come from and what your rootedness is extremely important to people. Now, of course, back in the day, we only have to trace sort of wedding photography to look at this. You know, my parents' generation, you had the one wedding photo, and then the next generation has the wedding album, and then the next generation has the video, and now we just have the whole plethora of a zillion photos on every platform that's going. But they'll be there for people to look at in the future, and that's part of discovering who you are. So in some ways, the use, it's the multiplication of them is there. And I think, as I said earlier, I think there was an interesting question about what gets destroyed and what gets kept. Because if there was only ever one wedding photo and someone destroyed it, then your identity and your searching for your past becomes more difficult, doesn't it? Whereas now there might be a lot more of it, and there's both pluses and minuses in that as well. So yeah, I think it is hugely important and part of the pastoral questions we might be wanting to explore with people as well.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you.
An interesting comment from that there's lots of toing and froing about WhatsApps and administrators, and someone say you can leave a WhatsApp group, but then someone says what happens to a WhatsApp group when the administrator dies? Perhaps somebody going without preparing it or handing it on. I mean, these seem to be very precise and difficult questions, but maybe, you know, that's just going to be part of the ongoing debate about how we negotiate these new spaces. An interesting comment from Jonathan Bauer: at a time when cemeteries / burials are seemingly decreasing, often ashes scattered in connected places of memories, is there an opportunity for online cemeteries and places of remembering, in inverted commas, which is worth exploring and developing new rituals, which are so important for many in working through grief, for visiting the virtual grave? So some really interesting points there, Jonathan. Thank you. And I'm guessing that, again, that's Sandra, maybe Ed, have got some thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I mean, to some extent, we've seen a little bit of this emerging with online digital books of remembering. And we certainly had a project that we were trying to explore in the Church of England of almost looking at the idea of a digital graveyard where you could put the name and you could leave things, and you could leave stickers almost that was like leaving the flowers at a grave and so on. And some of the problems that we still haven't been able to work through is the whole business of curating this, you know, because the online is both a positive space but also a bit of a wild frontier sometimes. So, you know, yes, that's great, isn't it, if all the people who put flowers on the grave are benign, but what if something happens that isn't benign? What if someone comes and, you know, messes or says negative things and so on? But I do think there is definitely something there about digital spaces, digital remembering that will emerge actually, and it's just a matter of time. Some forms of it are already out there, and sooner or later there'll be more of it as well.
There are actually quite a lot out there already.
Yeah, in all sorts of different ways. Yeah.
Maggie, John. Oh, sorry, yes, Ed.
Off the back of the prime example is our so-called social media Facebook notices, for instance. You get a lot of memories and shared and comments off the back of those, which stay for forever. And I think that's, you know, that's a really good point. That, and there are, as Maggie said, there are many sort of online memorial sort of options out and about there now. But Yeah, it's very true. But the other thing is we're forever having to police what people are writing, because, you know, if something goes up quite quickly, you've got to get it off quite quickly as well. You know, when you've got families at odds with each other and, you know, other things, you've got to be really careful on that, because you end up getting involved as well. But yeah, it's a very interesting point. Good point.
Thank you. Maggie, did you want to say anything briefly about the sort of those kind of virtual grave sites that are
No, I mean, one of the best recent sites has only been up about 6 months, is the Semtech site, which gives you lots of links and options to find things.
Right.
I'm just looking at Linda Boone's comment at the bottom.
Yes.
Yeah, this is really common. Lots of people Photoshop them in there, and there are whole pieces of artwork around this as well. But again, Sandra and Ed and Harry might know more about this than me. But yeah, I've seen a lot of this.
But again, what I find interesting about this, Maggie, is this is nothing new. The Victorians were very big on doing this, and
yes,
because photography was just being developed, and if you're and obviously infant mortality was higher than it is now, but it was not uncommon to wait until the photographer came. And you can see some of this at the V&A and other places, a whole thing about Victorian death photography. And you would prop the dead child up into the photograph, put the dead relative in there so that they were there for always. So it's not, it feels to us, because we've moved away from some of those Victorian remembering and mourning rituals, it feels weird, but actually it's got the same instinct in it, and the same emotional need, and possibly the same pastoral need as was there before. And of course there are cultures in the world, and I happen to have seen a bit of this at one point just as a tourist, where you keep your dead in the house for a very long time before you decide when the moment is right to bury them. So some of these patterns are already out there, and we're just seeing them now reappear in a digital form. But that was my question. When do we think, and this is always a pastoral question, when do we think that someone's grief is on a trajectory that is okay for them, and when do we think their grief and remembering needs support because they've got stuck in a place? So for example, we know perhaps people, particularly where there's been often tragic death, you go to the house and it's 20 years and the bedroom has never, ever, ever been moved. Everything is in the same place as it was the night their teenager died, after 25 years. Now, a little alarm might go and say, what's happening in this family? Is this healthy or not healthy? But on the other hand, you might go to see a family and they still had, you know, on the wall, the last football shirt someone was wearing, and you might not think there was a problem at all. That might actually just be part of a healthy remembering of someone who is part of your family. So these are very big psychological and pastoral issues. But in and of itself, I actually think it's really important, some of this.
Thank you very much. I think thanks very much. I think we've got time for one more response to one more comment or question that's appeared in the chat box from, say, Pasiti. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I haven't. Who asks, do we think that moving forward, these digital presences will reduce the emphasis on anniversaries of death and rituals and partial importance associated with them, thinking years, mind in intercessions? You were shaking your head very vigorously.
Yeah,
there,
I don't think it will. As I say, if as I'm suggesting, it's just part of our range of things we do to help us process loss and grief, then actually I don't think it will reduce the significance of anniversaries. It may be one of those things that help. I mean, already, you know, many of us will know this, on a Facebook page of someone who's died, anniversary things will come up. Or actually, just this week in It Was All Souls, there were many things being posted, and it isn't unhealthy when people say, I'm remembering this person today. It's part of that reconnecting, that node connections that Harry's talking about, of saying this person's legacy is still touching lives at this point. So I actually don't think that we will reduce the emphasis on not just the anniversary of the death, but all the significant moments in people's lives that come along. It will just be, we have different ways of bringing them to mind. But
thanks, Sandra.
Who knows?
Thank you. I'm just going to offer that comment, a chance for any other panel to comment on that question or any others before I hand over to John. Is there anything from those last couple of comments that the panel want to just add thoughts to? Don't worry if you haven't.
Just off the back of what Sandra said again, yeah, I think certainly that first year anniversary is a massive milestone. We always say 13 months is, you know, it's 1 year and a month, and it's the first of everything in that first year. It's a huge, and I don't think we never forget the date. It's like a date of birth, isn't it now? It's a date I remember. I've got the dates in my head ingrained that both my parents passed away, and it's something to think of, and maybe gets less over the years, but certainly the first 5 years, it's a massive part of your life calendar.
Thank you very much for that, Ed, and thank you for all your comments and questions. I think you really, they really helped to tease out some of the parameters of this debate. And I'm going to invite John in a minute just to give some concluding thoughts on whether he can see any connections and kind of ideas grouping and lumping together. But one thing that we talked about as a panel before this evening was recognizing this still feels quite, in a way, quite a fragmented conversation, and people sort of feeling their way forward from it. If during the next sort of 7 or 8 minutes, perhaps prompted by what John's saying as well, if there's any ideas that or suggestions for follow-up webinars that would take some of these questions into deeper territory and deeper you know, examination and debate, then we'd be very, very happy to continue thinking, well, how can we resource this whole debate? So if there's things here that we haven't touched, or questions that other people raised that you think, oh, yeah, I'd really like to understand more about that or get into that, then please put any ideas you have for future events in the chat box, and we'll certainly do our best to consider them. But John, I'm going to hand over to you now, if that's okay, just for you to draw some threads together, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was a good start, wasn't it? I mean, it seems to me there's an underlying question, which is, to what extent is the digital actually reshaping our practices and our beliefs? And at one level, it's possible to say, yeah, we're still doing the same sort of things we've all done before, but now there's new techniques, etc. It doesn't make a significant difference. Then on the other hand, it's a little bit sort of like Harry's question. He's saying, once these things can be done, they will be done. So I've got a question as to how far we want to go as a culture, as a society, as religious groups, in using some of these new technologies in terms of afterlife, etc., funerals, and so on. So there's a real question there. How do you make that decision? What sort of theological criteria might you have, or pastoral criteria might you have? And it seems to me that we are entering uncharted territory, and that's coming out again and again in the comments that people are making, because we do not know how to do this, or we're trying to experiment and work out how to do it. And because the pandemic has moved things forward so quickly, things are happening almost by default. As Ed said, yeah, I live stream funerals now, for instance, are becoming more and more normal. Have we actually stood back and asked ourselves, what is the real significance and meaning in this? Who is it for? What difference does it make? Who benefits? And so on. Can I just comment on, because somebody in another meeting that Maggie and I were part of pulled us up on this, the idea that these digital traces and so on are forever actually is not true, because the digital is itself, to one extent, material and physical, and it will degrade. It might be over a long time, but it won't last forever. So the idea that you are creating through the digital something that lasts forever is not actually quite accurate. So we need to think about that, the idea of permanence, impermanence. There's a different dynamic at work there. Last week, I was helping to home educate my 13-year-old grandson in the subject of philosophy, as you do when you're 13. And I asked him to look at Augustine, and he looked at Augustine. He said, oh, I didn't find that very interesting, except the idea of the soul. So we then spent about 45 minutes talking about the soul, and it's fascinating that actually that subject hasn't really cropped up during the course this evening. We have not talked about what it is we might believe about what happens after death. digital afterlife, what do we think is actually going on there? That has not emerged through this conversation. And I said to my grandson, what question were people trying to address when they came up with the idea of the soul? It was, what happens to us after death? And if we believe that there is some sort of survival after death, what is the essence of us that carries on after death? All right. And that tracks back to our understandings of identity here and now, which again is why Harry's stuff is interesting about being nodes on the network. Because if our identity is not something that belongs to us as lone individuals, it is something to do with our relationships with other people, then certainly part of what survives for as long as those relationships and memories survive, but in the end they go as well, they disappear. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to create some sort of immortality through those networks? Does that really change? Or again, the question is, who is this for? Is it for the person who's died? Or is it for those left behind? And what's the impact upon either? And I sort of almost smiled to myself because my mother-in-law died in September last year, and we are still dealing as executors with the impact of her death. Like, we can't sell a flat in Banbury, Ed. If you know anybody who wants a flat in Banbury, let them know. Okay. And I said to myself, Grandma, you're still there. And it's not necessarily positive either. I mean, who deals with a WhatsApp? It's something as executors. You leave it in the will, don't you? It's something else, yet something else the executors have to do. Right, yet more to be carried on. I do think one of the things we need to understand about the digital is it's helping us, if we want to be helped, to reconfigure time and space. Time and space are being reconfigured by the impact of the digital, and we're still working out what that means and how to deal with it and how it reshapes us. I'm with Harry. It shapes us as we shape it as we go along. And if we don't think it through critically and stand back and work that out, then things are going to happen by default. We'll end up doing things and we'll stand back and say, why did we allow that to happen? Who was it for? Why has this happened? Yeah, I mean, there's so much more really, but I think we're sort of running towards the end of time, Chris. So I think it would be helpful to know, I suppose, what people's concerns are, because I suspect that people are encountering this at a very practical level, first of all, through things like funerals and so on. But to dig beneath it to get some of the deeper sort of theological questions, I think, would be something we might want to go on to be able to do in future sessions. Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, John, very much. And we're coming up to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank John for leaving us with some good questions to reflect. Tim has just put up in the chat our next webinar on December the 1st, which is looking at partnerships between local authorities and faith groups during the pandemic and using Derby as a case study. And thank you very much as well for those of you who put in some suggestions for future work that we might take forward. I'd like to thank all our panelists for giving up their evening to share in this webinar and for all the very rich insights. I still feel there's a lot of work to do just trying to bring them all together, but thank you for giving them an airing and putting them before us. And I wish you all a very good evening in whatever you're doing. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.